Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when danger came in the quietest of forms and safety. Hope and freedom might have been stitched into fabric by firelight. You're sitting in a wooden rocking chair beside a glowing oil lamp, listening to the ticking of a distant clock. The windows are shuttered. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and worn cotton. Outside, the night presses in, still and heavy, but inside, there's a hum of quiet labor, a circle of women threading needles through patterned cloth. They don't talk much, not about the real things, but their hands speak volumes. You probably wouldn't last long in their shoes. Literally, they're wearing shoes they made themselves. And the blisters alone would be enough to send you running back to the 21st century. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a creaky, wooden floor, pausing as a shadow moves behind a drawn curtain. The year is somewhere in the 1850s. The location, hard to say, maybe rural Pennsylvania, maybe a dusty corner of Georgia. What matters more is that you're in a home that hums with quiet intention. A kettle simmers, a cat blinks slowly from the windowsill, and in the corner of the room, a woman sits with a quilt spread across her lap. She's sewing something: ordinary squares, triangles, tiny stitches, but nothing about this quilt is truly just for warmth. This one's a signal, and she knows it. The whisper of the Underground Railroad has already passed through this house. There's no map, no cell phone, no flashlight to guide those fleeing northward, just landmarks, gut instinct, and maybe a coated quilt hung out to dry on the porch. Historians still argue whether quilts were actually used this way, if they ever truly served as communication tools between safe houses and freedom seekers. But even if no one can agree on the truth, the story has been told enough times to hold weight. Sometimes stories themselves are maps. She pulls the needle through again. One square is deep indigo, another saffron yellow. There's a star pattern emerging in the center, North Star, she calls it. Not because she thinks anyone is watching, but because maybe, just maybe, someone is. Someone desperate, hidden in the woods, hoping for a sign that it's safe to keep moving. You sit nearby, wrapped in a thin shawl, pretending to mend your own garment. Or really, you're just listening to the scrape of the needle, the creak of the rocking chair, the slow hush of survival happening right in front of you. The walls of the room are lined with wooden shelves. On them, tins of dried herbs, folded cloth, and a basket of letters. None are addressed, at least not in any visible way, just bundles of thread, notes on colors and symbols. It's not evidence exactly, it's more like intention, stitched small and quiet. Suddenly, a knock at the back door. The woman freezes, then slides the quilt over her knees. She nods toward you, and you know what to do. Pull the curtain, dampen the lamp, hush your breathing. The air becomes a held breath. When she opens the door, there's only a man with a sack of flour, or at least, that's what he appears to be. They exchange 3 words, barely whispered, and he's gone. She doesn't explain. She doesn't have to. Later, she'll hang the quilt outside. Not on the front porch, that would be obvious, but in the garden, near the fence. It will flutter slightly in the wind, and its colors bold red triangles, a zigzag line of teal. For tiny black squares in the corner might mean nothing to a casual observer, but to someone who knows what to look for, it's a message in plain sight. You fall asleep on a rough straw mattress later that night, the echo of the day's silence still thrumming in your ears. Somewhere outside, an owl calls. Somewhere further away, feet press through dark woods, guided not by compass, but by faith in a square of cloth and the hands that made it. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Morning comes quietly, just a soft blue-gray light filtering through oiled paper windows and the creak of beams, settling as the house exhales after a long night. You stretch beneath a thin blanket, fingers brushing the woven texture of a quilt that feels older than the house itself. It's heavy, warm, and faintly scented with lavender and ash. The woman from last night is already up. You can hear her humming low from the kitchen, the clink of a kettle, and the rhythmic squeak of a treadle sewing machine somewhere in the back room. You rise slowly, bones stiff from a straw mattress and uneven floorboards. The cold nips at your toes. Your shoes were placed neatly by the door, stuffed with rags to keep out the damp. You shuffle down the hall, brushing your hand along the shelf where folded fabrics rest in tidy stacks. Indigo, rust red, a pale maize yellow, a brown so deep it nearly swallows light. Breakfast is plain, oats, a few slices of stewed apple, and the sharp taste of sorghum molasses. No one speaks much in the morning here. It's safer that way, but even silence has its rhythm like a song. Everyone knows the steps to die after the meal. The woman gestures for you to follow. In the parlor, sunlight spills across a large wooden frame. Today's quilt in progress is stretched taut inside it. Waiting, you help hold the corners as she pulls her chair close and begins stitching once again. This one is different from the last. You notice right away, it's made almost entirely of triangles. Some face upward, others down. Together they form what she calls the flying geese pattern. According to legend or maybe whispered instruction, this design told travelers to follow the path of wild geese heading north in springtime. Historians still argue whether this is fact or beautiful fiction. There's little in the way of documentation. No diagrams, no first-hand testimony from those who placed their lives in these patterns. But something about it rings true in your chest, how nature might become compass, and how cloth might hold direction without pointing a single finger dot as she stitches. Her voice floats like wind through wheat. She explains that every element has meaning, at least to those who believe it does. Black squares might mean danger. Zigzags could warn of nearby rivers. A house block might say, "Stop here, it's safe." You ask her, gently, whether anyone ever stitched a mistake. "Oh, all the time," she says with a half smile. "But even mistakes carry meaning, child, maybe especially those. You think of how often you try to correct every flaw in your own life, how you erase, backspace, overthink, and here's someone embracing a wrong stitch like it's part of the plan." Outside, the wind picks up. A line of washing flutters, undergarments, work aprons, and one small quilt square pinned among them. It looks like nothing special, but you know better now. Later that afternoon, you help sort scraps, cotton, linen, flannel, pieces too small for warmth but perfect for a whisper. She picks up one rectangle of old velvet and holds it against a scrap of muslin, considering. "This one," she says, "is for a rail fence." You blink. "Like a real fence?" She chuckles softly. "Not quite. The pattern looks like one, though. And if someone's traveling through the woods and sees it hanging outside, they'll know to follow the next fence they find until they reach water." Again, there's no proof of this. No neat historical document saying, "Yes, here is exactly how the secret code worked." But the lore is rich, textured, passed from hand to hand like the quilts themselves. You spend the afternoon stitching, one of your own. Your hands are clumsy, your thread tangles, and you prick your finger more than once. But the woman doesn't correct you. She simply nods and says, "Your story will come through the seams." There's something profound in that, something deeper than a history book could explain. That your body remembers more than you know, that your efforts are slow, uneven, deeply human effort is enough. As the sun dips low and the hearth is lit again, she spreads a finished quilt over her lap. You sit beside her in the fire's orange glow, tracing your fingers along the patterns. Wagon wheel, log cabin, drunkard's path, all with meanings, maybe or maybe not. Sometimes, she says softly, we stitch just to keep our hands busy, just to stay sane. That's a kind of message too. And you think of all the ways people today try to speak without speaking. A playlist sent to someone who won't reply, a tweet deleted before posting, a favorite video played again, not for the content, but for the comfort of its voice. Quilts, you realize, were their version of that. Memory blankets, directional prayers, quiet rebellions. When night comes, again, and you lie under the same patchwork as before. The fabric feels heavier somehow, not like a burden, but like protection. It's seen more than you have. It's carried more hope. And outside, pinned discreetly on the closed line, a small square flaps gently in the breeze. Its colors sharp against the moonlight. You wonder if anyone will see it tonight. You wonder if it matters. Maybe it's enough that it's there. The next morning, you rise before the sun, not from duty, but from a strange sense of welcome. The kind of warmth you feel when you're exactly where you're meant to be, even if you don't quite understand why. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders, woven with rough wool and smelling faintly of cedar and thyme, and step outside. The air is sharp. Dew clings to the wooden steps, and a fog lingers over the field beyond the house. You squint toward the edge of the clearing where a worn footpath vanishes into the trees. That's the road, you think. That's where they come. From travelers, runaways, dreamers carrying nothing but silence and scraps of information. Back inside, the woman is already awake. She stands over a pot on the stove, stirring slowly, her silhouette framed by the soft light of dawn. Beside her, a cloth bundle rests on the table. Today's work. She unwraps it carefully, revealing more quilt pieces, some finished, some barely started, all meaningful. You sip tea, bitter, herbal, with a hint of mint, and with smoke can. She tells you about the quilts that weren't meant to last. Temporary ones, fast ones, the kind stitched from burlap or old flour sacks. They weren't made for show or beauty. They were meant to be hung, quickly seen, then taken down. A flash of signal, gone before questions could be asked. This morning square is a bear's paw, jagged edges, claw-like corners. It's said to show the path of wild animals through the forest roots. Only the land remembers. You run, your fingers over the points, imagining feet bare or booted stepping carefully across wet leaves, tracing the paw-printed cloth and ground alike. Historians still argue whether these meanings were universal or local of one households. Bear's paw meant safety, while another's warned of danger. There's no consensus, just whispers passed down through families, often over sewing circles or washing lines, careful not to speak too plainly. That's the thing about secrets. The moment you try to write them down, they stop feeling secret. You ask if anyone was ever caught because of a quilt. The woman stiffens just slightly, then shakes her head. No stories like that survived, she says, her voice a little lower now. But that doesn't mean it never happened. That's the second lesson of this place. Absence isn't proof of safety. Sometimes it just means no one was left to tell by midday. You've joined her in cutting shapes, triangles, squares, narrow strips. She shows you how to layer them like meaning itself, building a message that only the right eyes will see. You're not very good at it yet, but she doesn't mind. Her movements are slow, patient, almost like prayer. And then she pulls out something unusual, a piece stitched in tight. Uneven lines of embroidery, red thread, hard to see unless you're looking. You lean in. They call this writing, she says. It's not letters, not words, but placement. She explains that some women develop their own code, using certain stitches in certain spots like Braille, without the touch. A line of red on the left meant stop, blue on the right meant go, green down the center, follow. It's speculative, of course. Historians still debate whether this kind of signaling was ever truly used, or if it's the wishful thinking of later generations looking for romance and resistance. But as you look at that thread, its length, its location, you understand how a woman with no vote, no title, no voice in law could still leave behind a map. You ask how they knew who to trust. She smiles at that. One of those sad, half-hollow smiles. They didn't, she says, but they trusted the work. That phrase lands like a needle pressed gently into your chest. Trusting the work, not the people, not the plan, just the ritual of doing stitch by stitch, message by message until the message carries itself. Later that day, the woman shows you a quilt top she never finished. It's pale, faded in parts, with one square torn from the corner. Left it like that on purpose. She says, sometimes you have to leave things undone. You don't ask why, you just nod. Maybe the missing piece is its own kind of signal died as the light fades and fireflies blink in the meadow. You find yourself standing by the clothesline again. The small square is gone now. In its place, another pattern. Wagon wheel, you think, or maybe Jacob's ladder. It's hard to tell in the dark, but someone will know. That night, you lie beneath another quilt that's one newer, lighter. It smells faintly of iron and old soap. As you drift off, your fingers trace the lines between each patch, as if you might read them in the dark. Your thoughts go quiet again, slower now. Threaded like stitches repeating, purposeful, soft. The next day, the house is quieter still. The morning sun comes late, filtering through thin linen curtains and landing in faded gold across the floorboards. You wake beneath a patchwork quilt, warm but not heavy, as if held by memory itself. The woman isn't in the kitchen this time. She's outside, gathering kindling near the edge of the woods. You wander the house alone for a bit. Every object seems to hum with used baskets with worn handles, spoons with softened edges, a hearth lined with bricks smoothed by years of heat. These things weren't meant to be decorative. They were meant to last, or at least to serve. On the wall hangs a faded sampler embroidery stitched in neat lines. Industry and virtue, it reads, though the thread has faded in places. Below it, another square, this one framed in wood, not a full quilt, just a block. Drunkard's path. You stared at a wild dot at twisted curved pieces, broken. Circles, no obvious direction. Some believe it meant a winding road, a warning of danger ahead. Others say it marked a hidden route only the most desperate would follow. But historians still argue whether it was ever used in the Underground Railroad, or whether modern minds simply projected resistance onto every crooked pattern. You walk outside. The woman is crouched beside a stone ring, coaxing flame from dried grass. She looks up at you, eyes squinting against the sun. Today's for scraps, she says. You help gather them tiny remnants from older quilts. Bits too small for a full square, too colorful to discard. They go into the crazy quilt, she explains. A patchwork of fragments. No symmetry, no pattern, just stories stitched side by side. This is how we hid things, she tells you. They look too wild to mean anything. And she's right. Crazy quilts were chaotic by design, often decorated with velvet, silk, or even metallic threads. But deep beneath the disorder, meanings could be tucked in. A certain red triangle next to a blue diamond, always facing east. A yellow corner touching. A black square. It looked like chaos, but to those who knew, it whispered like a map. You thread a needle. The woman shows you how to start from the center and spiral outward. Let it build like thought, she says, like remembering later. She brings out a pile of unfinished blocks, wrapped in an old linen towel. Some are neat, some framed, all feel like voices. She lets you choose one. You pick a starburst white, an indigo triangle spinning out from the center point. You trace it with your thumb. You feel the texture shift where the fabrics meet, one smoother, one thicker. This, she explains, is a North Star block. It wasn't just a symbol, it was literal. People followed the star of freedom Polaris, fixed and unwavering. If a block like this appeared on a line, facing a certain way, it might suggest a direction or a hope. Historians still debate whether these interpretations are true, or whether generations have filled in gaps with longing. But here, in this quiet clearing, it doesn't feel like invention. It feels like truth passed hand to hand, like fire in a cup palm. You keep sewing, not because you know how, but because your hands seem to understand what your mind doesn't. The rhythm of it, the slowness, the quiet purpose. The woman doesn't speak much, but when she does, her words land heavy and sure. You can't stitch fear away, she says, but you can give it form. That helps. That afternoon, a visitor arrives. He's quiet, older, with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He greets the woman with a nod, then sets the bag on the table. Inside, more squares, some tattered, some vivid, one shaped like a log cabin. Its center square red, always red, to represent the hearth. That one, the man says, could mean safety, or it could mean the place is watched. Again, the scholars disagree, but that's never stopped the stories. The man doesn't stay long. He leaves with a jar of preserves and a new quilt folded neatly in his pack. As he disappears down the road, the woman returns to her work, and you join her. Evening falls slowly. The air smells of damp earth and boiled roots. You sit by the fire, pressing your finished square flat with a stone wrapped in muslin. It's not perfect. The edges are uneven. A stitch near the bottom has come loose. Still, the woman places it atop the others. It'll say what it needs to say, she murmurs. You don't ask what it means. Not yet. Some stories only unfold with time. That night, you sleep beneath the same quilt, but something about it feels different. Maybe it's the extra square tucked into the bottom corner. Maybe it's the way you now know how to read the seams. Either way, the warmth feels deeper, more earned. The next morning, the house smells of ash and apples. You wake early, even before the rooster, and find yourself tracing the edge of the quilt. With one lazy finger, there's a thread sticking out where your square was added. You don't fix it. It's a flaw that reminds you it's yours. You step into the kitchen to find the woman already at the table, needle in hand, face turned toward the small window. It's raining today, soft, steady, soaking rain that taps the roof like a long-forgotten lullaby. A day for inside work, she says. Letters, she tells you. Today we stitch letters. You tilt your head, puzzled. Aren't letters written? They are, she answers, but not always with ink. On the table, she lays out a set of small squares, each a different letter of the alphabet, each built from fabric rather than pen. You recognize a few, a red X stitched into a white square, a blue L made with careful seams, an abstracted S formed by curved embroidery. They were used to spell, she explains, to leave messages. You just had to know how to read them. Historians call this symbolic piecing, a method in which individual quilt blocks or stitched embellishments were arranged in ways that hinted at words, names, or instructions. An L next to a house might mean go left at the house. A chain of initials could name a contact. Some even suspect that entire quilts served as cryptic road maps for those fleeing slavery, though. Of course, historians still argue whether that was truly their purpose or a later romanticization. Still, the theory persists, and something about the quiet logic of it, its privacy, its deliberate slowness feels true. The woman shows you how to fold and pin letters from scrap fabric. It's harder than it looks. Straight lines rebel against curved. Scissors, corners stretch unexpectedly. You ruin your first attempt at a G and laugh at the mess it becomes. The woman doesn't mind. Every message can be mended, she says. You wonder how many women sat at tables just like this, folding secrets into linen while pretending to sew blankets for winter. You picture them stitching by candlelight, heart racing as they press meaning into cotton, not for poetry, not for beauty, but for survival. Outside, the rain thickens. The sound is a curtain between the house and the world. Time folds like cloth. You find a rhythm in the cutting, pinning, pressing. It's like building language from color. You finish a sequence, 5 letters, pieced in indigo and russet. Your stitch is crooked but proud. The woman reads them aloud, softly, STOYS. You hadn't realized that's what you wrote. She doesn't comment, just nods and hands you a square of ivory cotton to frame your word. It will go into a larger top. She explains a message that only you and a few others will understand. A language older than speech, slower than ink, and safer than memory. Later that day, she brings out a quilt top in progress. It's vast, the size of a bed, with dozens of blocks, each a different symbol, each one precise. She spreads it out on the floorboards, and the two of you kneel beside it. Some pieces are literal trees, roads, cabins, rivers. Others, abstract spirals, stars, ladders. Together, they hum. The woman traces a finger along the path of a double arrow pattern. Means go back, she says. If they were already too close, too seen. She touches a flying geese block triangles pointing north. This one gave hope. It's not about certainty, she explains. It's about possibility. The chance that someone might read what you left behind and understand enough to keep going. Historians still debate whether these interpretations are true, whether enslaved people had time, freedom, or materials to sew such elaborate coats. But here, in this quiet place, you see the power in believing they could have. That belief itself might have been part of the survival. The rest of the day passes in hushed concentration. You help lay out squares for joining. You press seams open with a hot brick wrapped in wool. You learn to recognize the difference between cotton and linen by touch alone, and you listen to the rain dot, to the scissors dot, to the whispery voice of fabric. As it folds dot, evening finds you in front of the hearth, the fire low, the quilt top draped over your knees. You trace the blocks one by one, like pages in a book. You begin to see patterns not just in the colors, but in the logic dot. It's a conversation. You realize, not a scream, not even a whisper, a murmur, something quiet passed hand to hand, heart. The heart dot. The woman sits beside you, working on her own block. She hums a tune you don't know, soft and slow. It sounds like something that might have come from a time before written music. A lullaby sewn into air dot. You don't ask what the song means. You just keep stitching. The fire crackles again in the dark as another morning slips into being, and you wake still draped in the unfinished quilt. Your fingers are stiff from sleeping, curled around a needle, the faint ghost of thread lines pressed into your skin. You stretch, careful not to disturb the blocks now layered like secrets across the wooden table. Today, the woman announces, you'll study the codes, the visual metaphors woven not just into letters, but into whole patterns and configurations. She opens a chest you hadn't noticed before, drawn from beneath the cot with a low scrape. Inside is a folded bundle of old tops, never quilted, never finished, teaching pieces. She explains. You lean in as she lays them out. The color palette is richer, older saffron, madder red, indigo, nearly black from age. Each top is a classroom in cloth, and in them, layers of meaning stitched into the simplest forms, knots, arrows, fans, stars. There's a popular block she points out first, the log cabin, a central square of red, surrounded by concentric stripes of light and dark, the heart of the home, she says. When the center's red, safe place. When it's black, some believe this pattern marked friendly houses. Others say it was just tradition. Historians still argue whether the colors held a secret meaning or were chosen from what scraps were available. But what strikes you is how something so ordinary could become a beacon. Another square, the Bodhi, blocked for wedges, slightly off kilter, stitched together to resemble a knot. My mean dress well, be ready, the woman says. For a wedding, for a journey? No one knows for sure. But like all signs in dangerous times, ambiguity may have been its greatest defense. You try to memorize each shape, but they blur. Flying geese, tumbling blocks, monkey wrenches. You repeat their names softly under your breath like a strange poem. Bear's paw, drunkard's path, broken dishes. Each pattern with a story, a possibility, a gesture. You ask why these names exist. Same reason songs do, the woman says, to carry memory in the afternoon. You start assembling a practice sampler of your own, each block, its own metaphor, a crossroads, a safe haven, a warning. You find yourself drawn to the star shapes, compasses, almost. Though they point to nothing specific, your stitches are clumsy today. You prick your finger and don't mind. There's a kind of trance in the repetition. Fold, pin, stitch. Fold, pin, stitch dot as the sun shifts. So do your thoughts. You picture the women who designed these blocks, not as silent martyrs or distant ancestors, but as real people, annoyed when their needles broke, laughing when the cat walked over their work, crying when the fabric ran short before a border was finished. You think of their resilience, not loud or performative, but quiet, dogged, stitched into necessity. Their hands worked when words couldn't. Their needles knew what to say. Later, the woman hands you a pattern called the North Star. You've seen it in books before, 8 points radiating outward, sharp as compass needles. She shows you how to center the star in a field of dark cloth, how to align the seam so it stands proud and steady. Guidance, she murmurs, always needed. She doesn't ask if you believe the stories, neither do you, because belief isn't the point. Presence is. You sit with that square for a long time, and as dusk falls, the woman surprises you. She unfolds a tiny, warm quilt no larger than a baby's blanket. Mine, she says. The edges are frayed, the fabrics are faded, but the blocks small and deliberate still hold their shape. You spot a tree of life, a path, a single red square. I made it when I left, she says simply. You don't ask where she went or what she left behind. The answer is stitched right in front of you. That night, you dream of thread turning into rivers, rivers into pots. The quilt blocks become landscapes, shifting beneath your feet. You walk the drunkard's path, veer into flying geese, shelter beneath the log cabin. Above you, a north star shines not in the sky, but in the folds of cloth. When you wake, the woman is at the window, watching the sunrise. She doesn't speak. She just hands you a folded square of cloth. Your name is stitched into it. No longer a guest, no longer a stranger. You've become part of the story now, written not in ink, but in thread. You carry the cloth square with you all morning. It's like just a single block, but it feels like something weighty in your hands. A page from a book that isn't finished yet. Your name stitched at the corner in neat brown thread, looped and small. The way someone would sign a letter meant for safekeeping. The woman doesn't say much today, which suits you fine. You've fallen into a rhythm here, slow, silent, stitched. She hums as she works, the same tune she's hummed every day, though you still don't recognize the melody. You don't ask what it is. It feels like a lullaby for something too old to name. You're tasked with piecing together a full row today, not just blocks, but transition fabric sashing, they call it. Thin strips that create space, like the margins of a page. You realize how important that space is. Without it, the blocks shout over one another. With it, they breathe. The row comes together like a sentence. There's a kind of grammar to it, the repetition, the patterns, the pauses. You realize each quilt isn't just a message, it's a language. And like any language, it requires fluency, not just in speaking, but in listening. You run your fingers over the fabric. Some parts are soft from age, others stiff from starch. Some blocks feel joyful, bright, symmetrical, daring. Others feel solemn, muted, uneven, hurried. You can tell when someone was tired, or scared, or careful beyond reason. There's a block you're drawn to now, one you hadn't paid much attention to before. The bear's paw, for claw-like triangles gathered into a square, repeated to make a larger whole. Means move carefully, the woman tells you, step where others have stepped. It's one of the blocks most often cited as a coded message in the folklore of quilted resistance. Legend says it guided the scapies through the woods, watch for bear prints, walk in them, blend in, leave no trace. Historians still argue whether any of this is provable, whether any quilt really carried a map. But the debate seems irrelevant here. The meaning is alive in the story, and the story is alive in the stitches. By mid-afternoon, you've finished the row. The woman lets you pin it to the quilt in progress on the wall. A slow-growing mosaic of memory. You step back and look. For the first time, it feels like yours is still rough, still crooked, but it speaks. That evening, she brings out a bundle of scraps and tells you to choose blind. Design your own block, she says. No pattern, just story. You close your eyes and pull 5 pieces, one saffron, one indigo, one russet, one soft gray, one near black. You sit cross-legged on the floor, turning them over in your palms. The fabric smells like wood smoke and starch. You lay the pieces out, move them around, rearrange. It's not a test, it's a mirror. You don't try to name the shapes yet. You just begin stitching. The thread is uneven. Your needle snags. At one point, you accidentally sew the corner to your skirt and have to laugh quietly to yourself. But still, you keep going. The woman watches from the doorway, not intervening. Your block doesn't look like anything you've seen before. Not quite symmetrical, not quite balanced, but it feels right. There's movement in it. Diagonal shapes, a central square, a spiral, of sorts. You decide it means something like, keep going even when it doesn't make sense. That night, you sit by the fire again. The woman shows you a photo sepia, cracked at the edges of her grandmother holding a quilt, not smiling, just standing, grounded. The quilt is faint in the photo, but you see the North Star block, plain as day. She believed it meant something. The woman says, that was enough. You think of all the women who came before piecing beauty out of hardship, turning scraps into stories. Most of their names are forgotten, their quilts sold, lost, stuffed in trunks. But the stitches remain, the thread remembers. That night, you wrap yourself in the unfinished quilt and sleep more deeply than you have in years. You dream of footsteps through pine needles, a lantern swaying in the dark, a voice humming an old tune as you follow a path made of patchwork stars. When you wake, the fire is out, but the warmth lingers. On the table beside you, your block, pressed flat, edges bound. It's ready to be joined to the next one. You can hear the soft clatter of forks and the hum of conversation as you step into yet another gathering, not the grand kind, not a ball or a salon, but a modest sewing circle tucked into the parlor of a modest home. There's a fire going in the hearth, embers pulsing, and over the next hour or so, you're about to sit quietly with women whose stitches held centuries together, because tonight, you're diving into the power of the quilting bee. If you're picturing idle gossip and frilly bonnets, let's adjust the lens. These gatherings were social, yes, but they were also strategic. Women often denied access to formal politics, publishing, or positions of leadership. Used quilting as a subtle form of influence. A quilt wasn't just warm, it was communal. Every square collaboration, every thread an affirmation that something could be made, not just talked about. These quilting bees were serious work. Imagine 10 to 15 women, sleeves rolled up, all leaning over a shared frame, working in rhythm. The room smells faintly of beeswax and starch, teacups clink, and someone cracks a soft joke about the last town dance. But mostly, the focus is on fingers and thread, and while the work carries on, so does something else. Information. Quilting circles were hotbeds of whispered news, whispered plans, whether organizing donations, planning abolitionist actions, or just helping one another survive the isolating duties of 19th century womanhood. These were not passive pastimes. These were safe zones. The sort of spaces where you could lower your voice and say what you really thought about your husband's politics or your neighbor's suspicious behavior. Historians still debate how many of these circles directly participated in secret resistance movements like the Underground Railroad. But what's undeniable is this: they provided a social infrastructure, a network. And in the 1800s, when a woman's voice rarely traveled far beyond her front door, that network mattered immensely. In fact, many of the quilts we now prize in museums, those detailed log cabin patterns or bold star motifs, originated from these very gatherings. A dozen hands might have contributed to a single quilt, each one adding their name or initials with tiny, delicate stitches, and that quilt, it would later be auctioned to raise funds for an anti-slavery cause, or gifted to someone fleeing danger, or displayed in a window as an unspoken signal. These beads also allowed a space for teaching not just stitching techniques, but values. Older women passed down quiet resilience. Younger women learned how to encode care into cloth, and all of them, together, built a kind of emotional scaffolding that held communities upright. And then there's the funny part. Women are sneaky, not in a sinister way, more like delightfully resourceful. You'll find stories of embroidered initials belonging to fugitives, or poems hidden beneath binding seams. Some even stitched inside jokes only their circle would understand, like a cryptic phrase referencing an incident involving a goat, a misfired pie, and a blushing deacon. That part might not make the history books, but it's real, and it's human. In one town, a Quilting bee supposedly created a single blanket where every square contained a unique coded symbol for various safe houses. In another, one woman used blue stitching normally reserved for decorative edges to quietly point out which directions were safest to travel at certain times of the year. You can't verify every anecdote, but that's not really the point, is it? The point is that these women showed up regularly with needles and thread, yes, but also with intent, with solidarity, with that deep, stubborn kind of love that says, if I can't change the law, I'll change the fabric. And you're nestled in the corner, watching it all unfold, the way hands pass spools of thread, the quiet chuckles, the flicker of candlelight on embroidered stars. You feel the warmth of the room, not just the fire, but the warmth of community, of creation, of care made visible. And when the night is over, and the quilt frame is folded away, and the chairs are returned to their corners, the women leave with quiet satisfaction. They've done something, not loud, not world-shaking, but essential. And the next time they gather, they'll do it again, one stitch at a time. You stir just a little, shifting deeper into the fabric of the story. Because now it's time to explore something a bit more personal, more intimate. You find yourself in a small, dim bedroom. There's the creak of old floorboards, the scent of dried lavender hanging from a peg, and beside a wash basin, a quilt faded but chairs folded neatly at the foot of a narrow bed. This one isn't part of a public fundraiser or a protest. It doesn't hang in a church hall or auction house. This quilt is private. Because now we turn to the love letters. Yes, the 19th century had its fair share of sweeping romances and star-crossed situations. But some women stitched their affections not on a paper, but in a cloth. Imagine that for a moment. Your most vulnerable feelings sewn into the very thing that keeps someone warm at night. Sometimes this meant a quilt square embroidered with a name, a date, or a line of poetry. Sometimes it meant a motif of flower, a star, a bird that carried meaning only the recipient would understand. It wasn't just artistic expression, it was encryption. And here's the curious bit. Many of these tokens were never acknowledged in writing. Letters, after all, could be intercepted. But a quilt could pass through customs, through nosy relatives, through decades, carrying its message intact. Historians still argue whether a certain style, known as the sweetheart patch, originated as a coded way for women to express affection for one another. While mainstream society rarely recognized or allowed romantic relationships between women, these patches, often shaped like hearts or entwined rings, began appearing with increasing frequency. During the 1800s, just a coincidence, maybe, or maybe it was a quiet way of saying I see you in a world that refused to look. You picture a young woman, needle in hand, selecting her colors with care, indigo for loyalty, russet for longing, saffron for the ache of not being able to say everything aloud. The work is slow, deliberate. She doesn't write a note. She doesn't have to. Every stitch is a sentence. Now let's talk about mourning quilts. Yes, mourning. Because in the 19th century, grief had rules. There were mourning periods, mourning attire, even mourning jewelry made of braided hair. But some women, especially those too tired or too private to follow every societal formality, channeled their sorrow into patchwork. These quilts were darker in tone, thick deep crimsons, charcoal, stormy blue. They often incorporated scraps of the deceased's clothing, a sleeve here, a collar there. In some cases, they even included embroidery of initials, dates, or hand-stitched epitaphs. Quiet eulogies woven into bedcloths. It wasn't performative, it was survival. These women didn't just grieve, they carried grief. They slept under it. They kept their dead close, not with urns or portraits, but with warm fabric pulled over their shoulders in the loneliest hours of the night. And still, somehow, it was beautiful. You run your fingers over one such, imagine quilted stitches, slightly uneven in spots, the fabric softened from years of use. There's a square made from a child's christening gown, another from a husband's work shirt, each piece a memory, not mourned in public, or preserved in private. Then there's the final category, often overlooked, but no less rich, the unfinished. Quilt. These were often passed down like heirlooms, each generation adding a few more pieces, a few more rows, some never completed, but maybe that was the point. A reminder that life, like stitching, is often interrupted. Some women even wrote small notes and tucked them into the folded cloth guidelines for how they hoped the quilt would be finished, or small stories about where each piece of fabric came from. A blue scrap from the dress worn the day her son was born. A plaid square from a picnic blanket that once sat under a particularly memorable thunderstorm. You can imagine a future daughter or granddaughter discovering those messages, decades later, unfolding the cloth with reverence, reading not just the stitches, but the woman behind them. What a way to live on. And here's where things get even more tender. These unfinished quilts, often stored in cedar chests or linen cupboards, weren't failures. They weren't forgotten projects. They were bridges, a way for someone who had passed to still have one final conversation with someone not yet born. And you, dear listener, are now wrapped in that conversation. You're not just witnessing history, you're touching it. In your mind, you feel the weight of that old cotton. You hear the soft rip of fabric being cut, the thread pulled taut. You imagine the sigh of a woman stitching by candlelight, pausing now and then, not to rest, but to remember. The quilt is never just a quilt. It is testimony. It is protest. It is grief and love and joy and survival. Stitch one breath at a time. And tonight, it covers you too. Your breath deepens as the story weaves its final thread, and now you're stepping into a quiet room that exists outside of time. A room not made of stone or wood, but a memory stitched from the stories of women long gone, yet somehow still speaking, because as strange as it may sound, the story of quilting doesn't end when the last stitch is made. No, it stretches on like a well-worn thread, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. In this section, you don't simply watch, you inherit. Let's begin with legacy quilts. These weren't flashy. They weren't necessarily the most technically perfect, but they carried something more important: presence. These were the quilts made for daughters leaving home, for grandbabies not yet born, for weddings, for winters, for beginnings and endings. Each one tells a story, maybe not in words, but certainly in pattern. A rising sunblock for new starts, a tree of life motif to honor resilience, a starburst sown during a long illness. When hope was both scarce and essential, quilts like these might bear signatures, in delicate embroidery rows of names, spiraling dates, maybe even a stitched message like "for warmth when I can't be there." You trace these ghost letters now, your eyes closed, the thread cool against your fingertip, a whisper across centuries. Historians still debate how many of these quilts survived because of their sentimental value alone. Some were mended over and over again, patches placed atop older patches, like layers of affection refusing to fray. Others were stored carefully in hope chests, wrapped in muslin and lavender sachets, brought out only for special occasions or the softest nights of grief. And speaking of care, let's talk about the act of mending. This might be the most poetic chapter of the whole story, because mending a quilt is different from creating one. When you stitch something new, you're dreaming forward, but when you repair, you're honoring the past. You picture a woman bent over a worn square, perhaps one torn by time, or snagged by a child's careless foot. She doesn't discard it. She doesn't sigh. She simply selects a patch, perhaps from an old apron or handkerchief, and sews it gently in place, not to hide the damage, but to cradle it. This is where the quiet artistry lies, not in perfection, but in care. You don't erase the past. You stitch it tenderly into the present. Maybe that's why quilting circles endured for so long. More than a practical gathering, they were acts of shared remembrance. Women would sit in a ring, chatting, laughing, sometimes crying, the cloth stretched between them like a common ground, each hand contributing a line, each voice part of the pattern. These weren't just sewing bees, they were sisterhood. And you, here now, in this dream space of story and silence, are seated in a circle too. You don't need a needle, just your presence is enough, because the truth is, these stories weren't told to be remembered. They were lived to be felt. A quilt wasn't meant for admiration on a wall. It was meant to be used, slept under, cried into, tossed on the grass under a tree, wrapped around a child fresh from a nightmare. And tonight, you are that child. The world outside has gone quiet. The fire's long out. The chair in the corner creaks once, settling. The quilt, whichever one you've imagined, is pulled up to your chin. You are still. The voice you've been listening to is softer now, too. Not because it's fading, but because it's finished. You've wandered far tonight, not just through facts and figures, but through lives, through stitches, through time. And now it's time to let go. Let the story fold itself neatly beside you, like a blanket carefully turned down. Let your body rest in the warmth of knowing you have done enough. No more to finish, no more to fix, only sleep. And so, with the final thread tied and the last whisper spoken, you lie here still, soft, suspended. No more story left to follow, no more names to remember, just the quiet shape of what's been shared. Your breath is slower now, your body heavier, as if each stitch of the night has gently sewn you into this bed, this blanket, this moment. There's a calm that settles when nothing else is needed of you, when even your thoughts grow quiet, like children asleep in the next room. The world beyond your window turns on without you, and that's perfectly fine. Tonight, you've wandered through candlelit parlors and threadbare sewing rooms, along back roads and through secret patterns only known to those who needed them most. And now, you've returned not to the present exactly, but to a soft and timeless middle place, one that hums faintly with care. Let your eyelids stay closed, let your shoulders remain loose, let your mind forget the clock, the day, the destination. For now, you are wrapped in story, in stillness, in the quiet knowing that rest is not something to chase, but something to receive.